Hello everyone, this is Dr. Barry. The purpose of this presentation is to provide a brief overview of our final differentiation project for EDCI 595. Now before I dig really deep into the content and the requirements, I really want to encourage you guys to have fun with this project. I love this final project because it is an opportunity for you to really put into practice all that we have studied this semester. So your challenge is to design a lesson, or if you choose a group of lessons in your content area that demonstrates the use of differentiation, particularly for students who are identified as gifted and talented. What will your final product look like? Well, you need to turn in two things. The first is a presentation with a voiceover, so something very similar to what I'm doing right now. And the second is your pre-assessment. So the differentiation presentation will describe your lesson plan in detail and will really introduce your classmates to your entire plan and demonstrate how you're using differentiation. And then I'm asking that you also upload a copy of the pre-assessment that you would use in order to inform that differentiation. Okay, so I've created a differentiation template that you can use for this project. You're not required to do so, but just in terms of introducing the project, I usually find this pretty helpful. So I'm going to do two things. First, I'll very quickly walk through the template of what's required, and then I'll show you some examples so you can see what I'm looking for. So the very first component of this presentation is to describe your lesson concept. So what I mean by this is give us a brief overview of the content you will be teaching in this lesson plan, and make sure that you do so in a way that's very understandable because we all come from such diverse backgrounds. We are not all biology teachers or all English teachers or theater teachers, right? So make sure you make things clear for your classmates. Then you will copy and paste the aligned standards to your lessons. And then off of those standards, I want you to provide your learning objectives. Now, make sure that these learning objectives are really clear and also that there's a clear alignment between your standards and your learning objectives. So when I review these, I will go back to the standards that you chose and make sure that these match or align the objectives that you have for this specific lesson. From there, I want you just to consider some general background knowledge that your students will need in order to succeed in this class. The reason I want you to do that is this will kind of help you think about your pre-assessment. This can include things from your learning objectives, but it may be more general. Okay, so then we start getting into the meat of things. And the first thing I want you to do is to provide a summary of your differentiation. So I want you to answer both of these bullet points. This lesson is targeting student readiness, interest, or preference, and differentiation is for either content, product, or process. Now, I realize that these definitely overlap, and I would be surprised if you were only addressing one, but I do think for the purpose of this assignment, I want you to really emphasize one of these three, so readiness, interest, or preference, and then emphasize content, product, or process. That will help you as you kind of go through the presentation. So before you get into your procedures and what this lesson will look like, you're starting with an overview of your concept, here's my aligned learning objectives, and here's a summary of how I'm going to differentiate. Then you will describe your pre-assessment. So within your presentation, you don't need to include the entire pre-assessment, but I do want you to include just some pictures of it or some kind of example so your students and classmates get an idea. And make sure that your pre-assessment is, of course, actually addressing your learning objectives. This pre-assessment is super important because that's going to be what determines how you will group your students. which leads me to the logistics of differentiation. What I mean by this is, what will your classroom actually look like? So how are the students going to be grouped? Is it based off that pre-assessment? Some component of it should be based on that pre-assessment, but you also could provide other details that you may or may not have. How will you manage the classroom? So how will you make sure students are paying attention? Where are the students sitting? This slide is all about the practicality of your lesson, so the logistics of your differentiation. Then I want you to list your materials. If you have any materials that are very specific to this lesson, I want you to provide a picture of those materials or even external links so I can really get a sense of what this lesson will look like. That way, when you're sharing your final work with your classmates, they can also access those materials. From there, you'll discuss your procedures. This is going to be the bulk of the project, so I want you to be able to walk us through what would it look like to teach this actual lesson. You can do so by completely writing it out as procedures, or, and I would probably encourage you to do this, do a mixture of bulleted points and then describing the lesson through your voiceover. So make sure that you are being really clear of what this lesson would look like. And throughout that process, I want you to demonstrate how you're differentiating. After your procedures, you will discuss your assessment. This doesn't have to be like a formal end of class assessment. This can be something more formative, like an exit slip, or if you choose, it can also be summative and maybe more of a formal assessment, such as a quiz. If you choose to differentiate for product, then this section will be very easy because it can just be a summary of your various products. Lastly, you will discuss considerations and challenges related to your lesson plan. Again, real world. So one of the potential challenges is I have 3 groups going at the same time. I need to be careful of noise level. Here's how I may address the issue of noise level. Or I'm concerned that my 3 groups may finish at different times. Here's my plan. Okay? So the whole purpose of this presentation is practicality, practicality. And then lastly, I'd like you to list your references. This can include and should include your library resources, but more than that, also specific like content related materials that you may have found while working on your project. Okay, so that's your overview of what this is going to look like. And I realize, yes, this is a blank slide, but it's because I want to stop for a minute and talk to you guys. Do not be overwhelmed with this project. I want you to be using these differentiation strategies in your own content area. I'm not grading you on a perfect lesson plan. This lesson plan is a demonstration that you understand differentiation. So I realize that we are all at different points in our careers. That lesson planning might be very simple for you, or it may be a little bit intimidating. I'm not grading you on the lesson plan itself. I'm grading you on the fact that you are demonstrating you understand how differentiation is going to work. So with that being said, I'm going to walk through an example to help you understand what I'm really looking for with this project. So this is an example in a science classroom from a previous student. And this student decided to focus on the human skeletal system or skeleton system. And they wanted to really focus on differentiation for readiness. Okay, so this is their final project. And what I've done is just take excerpts of it to save time. I'm just going to highlight some of the things they did well and some things that they could potentially have done more effectively. Okay, so let's begin here. So the skeletal system, they first described, here's my lesson concept. So I've created in these boxes right here what's required for the different components, and then I was illustrating what this student did. So they described, here's a brief overview of my content. It's an anatomy lesson, students in my intro to anatomy class. Many of these students have a personal interest in medicine. They want to start thinking like doctors. So my target concept was reviewing the bones of the body, and they really wanted to focus on skeletal system injuries and what this might look like in the real world. This student had a particular circumstance going on because anatomy is an elective course. There were not any aligned state standards. This student was, of course, in my online class, so they were from Georgia. So they focused on Georgia's characteristics of science standard, which is first listed up here, but they really emphasized these lesson objectives. Okay, so students will identify and investigate problems scientifically. So they wanted to discuss how they made some hypotheses based on skeletal injuries, and that was aligned to that objective or standard, excuse me. But more importantly, these were their lesson objectives. So again, reviewing the major bones of the skeletal system, but mainly focusing on types of bone injuries and how these bone injuries could impact the skeletal system as a whole. They listed just a little bit of student background knowledge, of course, the bones of the body, skeletal system injuries. They also listed the function of an x-ray because they did some activities with an x-ray. I would have liked to see more detail here. What did the students just need a general understanding of in order to succeed in this lesson? So here is their summary of differentiation. I found it a little wordy, but I think this is good to kind of show you here. So they were targeting student readiness. Okay, so from their pre-assessment, they actually had 2 pre-assessments. They realized that in this elective course, the student readiness was kind of all over the place. So they wanted to make sure they differentiated for readiness. They also brought some interest in, as you'll see. They found out that many of their students were interested in medicine, so they wanted to address that. But they emphasized student readiness. And the lesson was mainly differentiated for learning process. So what the student did is they designed a activity with the cubing strategy, and you guys should be familiar with that. With cubing, we have various levels of questioning on the sides of the cube, and that's how the student addressed readiness, by making various levels of difficulty of questions. As the students were working in groups, they were examining the content of the skeletal system, particularly those injuries, but at different levels of thinking. So the process was different. So their pre-assessment, they actually had 2 different pre-assessments. Here they just described them. They had a blank skeleton that the students had to label to make sure they knew those bones, and then they used a KWL. On their next slide, they actually gave me an image of this. So of course they handed in the full pre-assessment, but this was just for their presentation. They had something similar to this, that students were required to label the bones, and then they did a quick KWL on what do you know about skeletal injuries, listing examples, what do they want to know, and then later on they completed this learned section. This is where the student could have improved. So they talked about logistics of differentiation, and I didn't actually include their work because I don't like to include work that's not ideal. They had a really interesting techniques of using this cubing strategy, and I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. But they didn't necessarily give a good description of how they grouped students. So the cubing had various different levels of thinking on the sides of the cube. What I would have liked to see is some kind of graphic showing me, hey, based off of these results, I made 3 groups of students in terms of readiness, and here's how I determined those 3 groups of students. The student didn't really provide much of that, so that was one area of improvement for this particular project. Okay, so they did include a list of materials. It was quite long, so I didn't actually include it here, but I did pull out a couple of pictures to kind of demonstrate that to you within the procedures that they included. Okay, so here are their lesson procedures. First, they started with an introductory activity. I thought this was cute. They showed the clip from Harry Potter when Harry loses all of his arms, and that created like a good starter conversation about what would happen if we didn't have our bones. A really good hook to the lesson. This component wasn't necessarily differentiated, but it was a good way to hook the students in. So this is where they focus mainly on differentiation. As I mentioned previously, the student had a cubing activity. And let me skip ahead. This is the cube that they created. So they had a cube that had various levels of thinking related to skeletal injuries. So for each of these different prompts, they had different activities. Make It was creating a skeleton or creating a bone out of Play-Doh and then demonstrating what it would look like to have a certain type of injury. Diagnosis, they actually had examples of different x-rays. Find It was finding an example of a bone on a class skeleton that they had in the front of the room. Drawing It, of course. Explain It, and Imagine It. They had a really interesting sample, like patient input form where they kind of made a story related to the injury. So this was their main tool for differentiation. Here within their procedures, they described what I just did you a quick overview for. So feel free to pause and kind of read this through, but for time's sake, I won't. What this is doing is showing me as the instructor that they have different levels on this cube. And according to which group the students were placed in, some of the cubes had all levels and some did not. So here they describe that. Some students who are struggling with basic concepts worked with a cube that just had components that were lower, such as Find It, where they located the actual bone on the skeleton, Draw It, and Explain It. And then for the more gifted students, they focused on a higher level, such as Diagnose and Imagine. I really appreciated this note. They actually had a third level for differentiation where students were specifically thinking about one bone and one type of injury and what that would look like together. So there's a lot of differentiation going on. Again, it would be a great improvement if the student had actually described how they determined their 3 groups. Within their procedures, again, they included things like, here's my cube, a sample of, this is the patient card they used for Imagine It. So they had to create a patient card of, if the student had a spiral fracture, this is something that could have happened. Then these were some of their sample diagnostic cards that they used. So very practical, really hands-on lesson. And finally, they discussed their assessment. Okay, so this student had a lot going on in terms of assessment. Within each group, the students were required to complete the same product, the same report sheet, in which they discussed, these are the concepts we reviewed, our cube prompt, and what happened, and reflect on it. For this reason, this is why they argued that they were differentiating for process and not product, because technically they all created that same product. Beyond that, they did an informal role play for an assessment in which they pretended to be doctors and looked at each other's x-rays. And it's a good opportunity for that student to cycle around and hear what the learning was going on. So the this student did not provide like a formal quiz or exam, which is totally fine. Then they discuss their considerations and challenges. I won't go into that. They were very specific because this lesson had actually been taught before and they were working on improving it. And lastly, they included their references. And of course, I won't go into that either. So this is just an overview of what one of these projects may look like. Yours may look entirely different. It may have way fewer slides or way more, and that's totally fine. Really what I want to emphasize from this project is how detailed their procedures were and also how they provided samples of these different materials that they would use. So I'm really excited to see your work. Please let me know if you have any questions. I did a fair amount of time in class to work on this presentation, and I did that to make sure that it would not be overwhelming and also to ensure that we could meet electronically if that would be helpful to you all. Thanks, and I look forward to reviewing your work.